Welcome to Thinking Aloud. We are here today with a special guest, Caroline Levine, who is professor and chair of the English department at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She's a specialist in Victorian literature with a particular interest in the relations between art and politics. She's the author of a really terrific new book called Forms, subtitled Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network, which was published this year by Princeton University Press. And she's the guest of our Humanities Center annual symposium. So Caroline, welcome to BYU.
Thanks, it's so great to be here.
It's great to have you here. I want to ask you, this book Forms, I saw it advertised first about a year ago, and I thought, what an interesting book. Now, forms in literature typically involves such structuring patterns as, for example, stanzas or chapters, first or third person narrative voice, units that help organize an experience of reading and interpretation. And sometimes it also can designate generic forms, a detective novel versus a Bildungsroman or something like this. But you have a more expansive concept of form that you develop, and it's really a concept about that relates structuring patterns in fiction to patterns of social experience, like forms of discipline in a workplace or a school. My first question is, how did you come at this expansive definition of form?
Well, it was your definition of form, which was beautiful, is you could see how many things are actually contained in it already. You mentioned, it could be the chapter, or it could be the stanza, or it could be a whole genre like detective fiction. And so I'm a kind of literal-minded person, and I was trying to figure out what this term form meant, and it was pointing me in so many different directions. Yeah. And I've always been fascinated by patterns and structures, and I thought, why is it that we call some forms and some structures? Like, what's the difference between like a social structure, maybe a bureaucracy, and a literary form? And I started to think maybe there's not as much of a difference as we've insisted on in our field, and that maybe we could use the same kinds of mental analytic frames to think about both. And as soon as I started to do that, I realized that some of my own assumptions about what literary or artistic forms were actually kind of limited by that I could think more expansively and take some of what I knew from, as a reader of literature, to social processes. And I thought that was really exciting. Like, let's export what we do in the humanities to a larger world.
Right. So this book, given the interest that you had in trying to figure out what these forms and structures were and just how expansive they could be, was this book like the product of many, many, many years of thinking, or was it the kind of thing where you had a dream one night and you tried in the morning to take it down rapidly before it was gone?
No, it was definitely many, many years of thinking. I actually date the first thought I had that ended up in this book to a seminar I took when I was a junior in college. And I had this wonderful professor named Claudia Brodsky, who I just followed from class to class. I just thought she was an incredible, genius of a reader. And she said, it was kind of an offhand comment, and she said, language is like architecture. We live in it all the time, and we don't notice it until it draws attention to itself, like when it's especially ornamental. And I thought, oh, that's true. It's like we're living in these structures, right? So from the time I was a junior in college to now, which I'm not going to say how many years that is, I've been trying to figure out that story. And I wrote two books that were really very different from each other. One was about suspense in the Victorian novel, and another was a book about how we think about arts in democratic contexts. And people would say to me, wow, you've changed your career so much, and I would think, no, there's something that they have in common. And so this book was really a way to kind of think through all these thoughts that I'd had for many, many years in different forms, and try to make a theory out of what was a kind of habit of my own thinking.
Oh, nice. All right. So about this theory, the chapters break down, again, the subtitle, like Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network, and you try to get your head around here 4 different kinds of forms. One of the most intuitively obvious for our listeners might be the idea of a whole form. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could explain briefly what a whole form might be.
Sure. So this one I got really interested in partly because in both literature and the arts, many people think of an artwork as having a form, a single form. So what they're talking about is how all the pieces come together into a whole. But sometimes when they're talking about form, they're talking about a particular piece of it. Like they're talking about, the moment when the novel goes into first-person narration, and they're not talking about the whole. And so I thought, well, what is this wholeness? And why do we think that that's equivalent to form? And I started to think about the criticisms of form. So there was a long period, as you know, when formalism was way out of fashion and people thought, oh, you shouldn't study literature in terms of its forms or art in terms of its forms. And that's when I realized that that notion of wholeness was something that people felt was dangerous because it was all about enclosing. It was all about keeping certain things in and not letting, outsiders in from the borders. So you could think about immigration and national wholes, or you could think about women being enclosed in homes. And I thought, oh, wow, this notion of the whole is actually everywhere. Yeah. And one of the reasons people are worried about formalism is they think it's going to be an imposition of this kind of wholeness on us. And that's always going to be about exclusion. So I was interested in thinking across all the forms in the book are both social and aesthetic. And it's the ways in which the two interact that I'm interested in, but also just to think about why we might fear this notion of enclosure or want it and think of it as a value was to me really interesting.
That is an interesting question, actually, because there's an ambivalence for this idea of wholeness, right? I feel unwhole, or I feel enclosed. It's kind of the same sentence. It's
exactly.
Two different forms. Can I use that word here? One of the chapters that I found really interesting was the chapter on rhythm. We often, rhythmic forms, you say a whole form, it's implicitly kind of a spatial idea. A rhythmic form is more a temporal idea, and I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that chapter on rhythms. You talk about it, for example, in terms of literary periods. And you make the really interesting point that we literary scholars live in multiple periods at once, which I thought was great. Can you explain what a rhythmic form is and how it relates to literary periodization?
So rhythm was one of those that came kind of late in my thinking, and I thought, there's all these forms that don't fit that notion of the whole, and rhythm is one of them. It could go on forever. And we think of rhythm as being often like natural and embodied. We have rhythms of our hearts. We think about dance as a kind of natural rhythm, that there's a way in which rhythm feels like it's not imprisoning the way that wholes and enclosures are. So I thought, okay, so here's a form that's liberatory, right? Well, no. It turns out you can use rhythms in ways that are very oppressive also. And so that was interesting, including thinking about slavery and the ways that slaveholders often used the rhythms of song actually to keep slaves working, and that the rhythms of labor and the rhythms of song have often been brought together, and that was very disturbing. But to go to the question of literary periodization, I started to think about how we organize time in general. What are we thinking about when we impose ordering on time? So we have all these ways in which we do that, and there's really great, I thought, interesting sociological work on how we think about time. So there are like things that shouldn't be longer than an hour, like a doctor's appointment or a piano lesson, and other things that shouldn't take place in the morning, like, like a party, right? So we have all these normalized notions of time. And that got me thinking about something that's always bothered me in literary studies, which is an attachment to organizing our temporal boxes of literary history. So we have Romanticism and then Victorianism and then Modernism. And so many things are moving across those periods, and we can't think that repetition across periods if we think in terms of boxes. So it was a kind of a spatializing of time that periodization seemed to do, as opposed to a thinking about repetition across time. And so one of the things I got interested in was if a lot of our experience is actually repeated across long spans of time, then each time you think of a period of time and you say, oh, that's a historical moment that produced X or Y, if it continues, then we're still living in that. So we're living in these multiple time periods. That's what I was really trying to get at. Right. Where if we go to a seminar, a seminar has a history, whereas if we go to a restaurant, it's a different history. And, in the same day, we might go to both. So.
It's almost like time travel. And so you take, for example, a professor of 19th century American literature, someone who kind of studies Walt Whitman, for example, or somebody. teaching 19th century American literature in a department where national literatures get organized in the 20th century in the 21st century classroom.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So multiple time frames at once, which is really quite interesting. You realize that, in a way, I guess we all function as our own artifacts.
Yeah, we've got these different temporal moments speaking through us all the time. And so sometimes our students will say, oh, I'm not interested in the past or whatever. You think, well, we're living in it. Like, it's organized. Like, this building was built in the past, and we're living in these technologies came before us. And language, these words we're using are Anglo-Saxon. And, that sense of being artifacts is strange and kind of uncanny.
It is, and it's a great lesson, actually. And so when you think about these literary structures that reflect larger social structures, there really is room here for some very provocative correspondences, some transverses across that make literature really instructive, I think, in how we think about the world outside of us. And I'm going to come back to that. That's a point I don't want to lose. Let me ask you this. These 4 different chapters, whole, rhythm, hierarchy, network, was there a 5th form that didn't make it into the book? Or was there one of those 4 that you found most poignant as you were working on the chapter?
That's a great question. I think there are lots of forms that aren't in my book. There was none that was quite as... I was trying to find forms that had lots of political weight and also were interesting to people in literature and the arts and had been part of our discourse for a long time. And there was no 5th one that didn't make it in for that. The one that's oddest in a way and that I'm in some sense most attached to is the network, because that's the one that's least often considered a form in literary studies or in art history. And so kind of trying to argue for it as a formal principle that we should be paying attention to meant reading in network theory and trying to study how networks operate. And instead of just thinking about them as big sprawls, which is what I think we're most likely to use it as a metaphor and to say, oh, everything's networked. But I was interested in actually thinking about it formally. So I'm very attached to that chapter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a very fine chapter, and you make a very good, I think, case for the relevance of networks to literary study, not just in terms of where we do see them often in digital humanities, for example, but how they're present actually in other kinds of literary structures that we've inherited. One point you make early on in the book is that you point out where literary studies has kind of been. I mean, if you go back a couple generations, there's a real fascination with formalist readings, kind of closed structures, understanding sort of works as entire entities unto themselves. You fast forward a generation, and now we're in a period when people say, well, it's not, the forms don't matter as much as the contexts matter, and understanding kind of the conditions that make forms possible, that's what counts. Have we entered a third moment? Is your book, do you think, part of a different chapter where it's kind of capturing a new sensibility in literary studies, or do you think you're still part of a second moment? How would you, I mean, thinking again about moments, and we talk about temporal structuring patterns, where would you situate your own book and interest in relation to that kind of schematic history?
Well, one of the things I've been so thrilled by and actually a little surprised by is the attention that the book is getting. And so I think it does strike a chord. I think there's a kind of hunger, and it's not just me, there's a bunch of people thinking about form and history together and trying to think about, some of the problems with form we know, but we could still use this term. We could still make it work for us. And in literary studies, it's been so important. It's still sort of so much the pedagogical bedrock of what we do to think about how words are structured, how narratives are structured in poetry. So I feel like there's a hunger for it, and that lots of people are trying to think it through in different ways, and we'll see what comes out of it. But yeah, it does feel like a different moment to me. When I first started writing about form, I had people tell me that it was not an interesting term, and that's no longer true. So that's a sign of some kind of shift in what's happened. One of the things I really wanted to do was to try not to forget what we'd learned about the criticism of form. So I think the danger when we think about moments and thinking, oh, we've lost something, is just to go back, to say, oh, we lost this valuable thing. And I wanted to say, no, I did hear all those critiques. It's just how to then keep going with this term, even knowing what its problems are.
Yeah, sure.
And that was the hard intellectual work of the book, probably the hardest.
Right. Great. It's an interesting project, and it really is a book of it's a book of literary theory that has lots of interesting moments from literary history inside of it. I mean, you've got a chapter where you analyze the Sophocles play Antigone. Charles Dickens makes an appearance. Modern TV shows. I mean, it goes really across a very large span. One of the points that you make about just kind of the sweep of history and the kind of the new sensibilities we have in criticism and literary scholarship, you talk about your father, who was a very fine intellectual historian. One of his books is on my shelf in my office, actually, and how he saw the world very differently. But also then how some of the people you were studying under in graduate school, would not have thought to write a book quite like this one. And I thought that was important. Why do you think the book is striking a chord in the present? Where are we in literary studies that a book like this seemed like it needed to be written?
That's a hard question. I do think that we don't know why things strike chords with us, right? I mean, this is why we need cultural historians to take account of us. And in this moment, I am genuinely surprised. I wasn't sure that this book would have any impact at all, that it might be forgotten and put aside on, my mother's shelf and nobody else's, which is what I worry happened to my other books. But in part because, you don't know when you're going to hit a chord. But I do think there have been these, one of the wonderful things about academia to me is the way there's constant self-critique and constant looking back at what our assumptions have been, and that there are moments where we feel like, oh, we worked through this problem and we saw its implications. So there was a moment of really powerful historicism in literary studies where we saw everything in historical context, and that was hugely important. But maybe now we know what that is. We can continue to do great work in that frame, but what do we need now to think about what might be missing in that model? And so I do think there are these, it's like literary history or the study of literature in the academy has its own periodization because it keeps asking questions. And out there in the world, things are a little messier. But within the academy, we get to say, okay, we did this, let's do the next thing.
What kind of work excites you and others when you read it these days? I mean, you've produced something that has really struck a chord, and I think it's important work. What kind of work, when you read it, really excites you in 2015 that indicates, some kind of really dynamic way of thinking for the present?
What I'm drawn to most these days, I think, is always work that has big consequences in it. I feel like I hungered for that for a long time, for work that made big claims. And a lot of what we're taught to do in academia is to make smaller claims just because we want to be really rigorous. But there have been some books lately and some movements. So the historians started to talk about big history, and that was a little bit controversial. And I understand that there's two sides to that, and I'm not really involved in that debate. But there was that sense of let's make big claims where academic work does connect to the things that we care about in a larger frame, and make sure that we're not just being antiquarians or just thinking in terms of adding little bits of knowledge. So there's a lot of different kinds of work that does that, but I'm increasingly drawn to world literature in the frame of thinking globally about literature, because national frames have always seemed to me to be very narrowing. And the people who do world literature, none of them are experts. And so they have to ask questions that aren't about going deep, but about thinking about making connections across different parts of the planet, and often without the linguistic knowledge that they should have, but they're still going to try to think globally anyway.
Right. That's an interesting way to put it, right? That the people who are, the experts in world literature aren't experts in the way that the experts in national literatures are experts. Yeah. It's a different way of thinking about the entire set of questions about what constitutes literary study. About sort of things that make broad claims, one of the things I think you would like literature to do, and one of the things that you would like your book to be able to do, is to do some kind of social or political labor, to make a point that things we study in literature can make an impact on things that are social. If nothing else, help us think more clearly about what's social outside of ourselves. What kind of work do you think your book does or might do or might inspire others to be able to do? What kind of thinking?
This really gets at a long-standing kind of crisis of my own, and I think a lot of professors in the humanities, where we want our work to do work in the world, and we're not quite sure how or whether or when it does that. And so it has been for me, this is the book where I feel like, okay, I kind of understand how I could take this into the world. And in fact, one reason I agreed to become a department chair in my own department was that sense of, okay, I'm making a claim about how we make things work more justly by paying attention to forms. So I'm going to pay attention to the forms of distribution and arrangement in my own department and make sure things are fair and make sure that we have processes that guarantee fairness. That's the kind of thing I've been thinking about. And so trying to take the insights from the literary into the world beyond the literary has been actually just trying to do it in a kind of daily way has been a challenge to me, and trying to think intellectually about the institutions that we live in and to reflect on them, not as necessarily there's a world outside the university that's where real political impact is, but even within the university, there's lots of politics, and we can think about what we know in literary studies and bring that to the universities where we live. But the other thing I was going to say is that I really have been trying to think about forms of sociability or connectivity or collectivity that might be different from the ones that we take for granted as political engines. You know, how do we actually make political change? Let's say you and I agree that there should be something done in this country about climate change or race or any of those things. How would we make that happen? What forms would we use? And so does literature have some resources for us for thinking about how collectivities are possible or where they break down or how we might imagine ourselves as one or as many, and how do we think that in a way that preserves our integrity, doesn't make you and me the same, but allows us to work together. So, you know, I'm trying to think these things, and then how to take those beyond the university is the next question. And one of the things I've been doing is working a lot with K-12 teachers and thinking about the teaching of literature in the high school classroom and how our traditional notions of expertise might actually be kind of mystifying literary texts for high school students, and that using a notion of form like mine might actually give them access in a way that's simpler, actually, and more accessible to everybody, more open to everybody. So trying to think about the high school classroom, and then I've been writing op-eds about public education and trying to think about that form. So I have a lot to kind of, I've been trying out, and that's the kind of task now for me, is to try to figure out what that looks like.
Yeah, great. And what you said, I think, about trying to figure out how forms of connectivity and collectivity work, how if we agreed that we felt we needed to do something about some kind of important issue of the day, how that would happen. That seems especially important in a moment when there's so little faith in the political process as it's been traditionally conceived. I mean, Congress's approval ratings just all-time lows, you know, and there's this general cynicism about that. And so to pose the question, okay, well then, how might things work? Mm-hmm. That way, sure, traditional ways, all right, but what other ways do exist? And I do think that's a question being posed more earnestly across the humanities. Mm-hmm. Do you see your sensibilities about this sort of shared by colleagues, whether at your institution or institutions across the country, more efforts to try to either work, whether it's working with K through 12 teachers or service learning projects, or inspire a different kind of way of writing by way of collective groups? I mean, do you see this happening more frequently?
I do think there's change happening at the level of where we think our constituencies are as humanists. We, for a long time, relied on the classroom, and now with declining numbers of humanities majors, we've had to think about what our mission is, and I think people are thinking wonderful and exciting projects in service learning and that kind of thing. What I've been kind of surprised and stumped by over and over again is that we have such habits of critique in literary studies that I'll be sitting with a colleague who'll say, oh, you know, the way that we're running this university is all wrong, and they'll give me a list of 10 reasons why, and then I'll say, so what do you think we should do? And they'll look at me like, that's not my job. And that's what I want to be our job, right? Is thinking to what we would do in relation to that. So I feel like getting us out of the critical mode and into a more creative building mode is something that there's a hunger for, but that we're still kind of taking baby steps. I don't think we're expert at that yet.
Yeah,
but
okay.
I think we might be heading there.
Yeah. We have probably about 3 minutes left or so, and I am wondering how you think about the direction of higher education. I mean, I think you're right that we are seeking broadly in the humanities, asking who our constituencies are, our students, of course, but who beyond that? I mean, who's out there? What can we share with our expertise? You work at one of the nation's really traditionally very, very fine public universities. It is a place at which sort of conditions have changed a little bit over the years. What have you seen changing there? And what do you think the future holds for your institution or institutions like it in the U.S.?
Yeah, so Wisconsin has maybe kind of a bellwether for what's going on. At least I feel like watching the relationship between the university, the humanities, and the kind of wider public and media process is giving me, I feel like I'm...
And state legislatures.
And state legislatures. I feel like I'm really thinking through this question constantly. And it's not optimistic. I mean, I think there's actual misinformation about the humanities. For example, this idea that you can't get a comfortable life if you major in the humanities. Those kinds of things are lies, and those get spread pretty easily, and then people believe them. But also kind of a gap between those who don't go to college and those who do, and those who don't go to college having to feel like they're footing the bill for something that's getting somebody else into the middle class, but they don't see they don't see what value is for them. And that for me is a sadness, right? I'd love to imagine that some of the excitement, intellectual excitement, and thinking about meaningfulness and thinking about value and collectivity, all of that could be shared. And the word university suggests that it's for everyone, that it's universal. So I think we could do some exciting experimental things with reaching populations who are not our students, as well as our students, as you say, but it's not going to be easy.
No, that's for sure. One thing I do love about your book is really helping kind of at least create paradigms that allow us to sort of imagine those questions more readily. And it's so great to have you here at BYU. It's great. Thank you for visiting, and thanks for sitting down with us and talking on Thinking Aloud.
Thank you, Matt.